Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Patent Literacy Symposium. And this session, the top 5 MTSS implementation errors and how to correct them for better reading outcomes. My name is Karen Deary, admitting people, and I'm so excited to be able to facilitate this session for you all this morning. Let me just go over a few housekeeping items before we actually start. Please remember that the handouts for this session you can find at the Patent Literacy Symposium Schoology site with, where you're getting all of your links and other materials for the sessions. The session handouts are within the folder for today, which is June 10th. So in the time slot for this session, which of course is 10:30 until 11:45, and you can find it under the name of this session. This session will be 75 minutes long, and it is being recorded. The chat feature has been turned off between participants, but you are welcome to use the chat box to submit questions for our presenter this morning, and I will monitor those and pass those along as they come in. Please keep your video feature off and your microphone muted. That helps to eliminate any potential sort of distractions to the presentation and for other people who are attending. We'd love for you to tweet out or share on social media all the great information that you're hearing and your new learning from the symposium. So you can do that via our hashtag, which is hashtag PALitSymposium2020. And I know it's small, but it's behind my head on my screenshot. So go ahead and share out all of that great new learning. So at this time, it is my immense pleasure to introduce to you our presenter for this morning. Dr. Stephanie Stollar is the former Vice President for Professional Learning at Acadience Learning Incorporated. She's an adjunct professor in the online reading science program at Mount St. Joseph University and a founding member of a National Alliance for Supporting Reading Science in Higher Education. Dr. Stollar recently formed her own company, Stephanie Stollar Consulting. You can follow her work on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Dr. Stollar.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much to all of the folks at Patent who have facilitated this fantastic learning opportunity. And thank you to everyone who is joining me today. I appreciate the time that you're giving up and the learning that we're going to be doing together. I am here today representing Acadience Learning, my former employer. Roland Good and Ruth Kaminsky are the authors of Acadience Reading, which you may have known as Dibbles Next. And you can find more information about their work at acadiancelearning.org. I am going to minimize distractions by turning off my video. And as Karen said, she's asking everybody else who is participating to do the same. So if you don't mind turning off your video and making sure that your line is muted, and you can communicate through the chat, and Karen will jump in when there are immediate questions to be answered. So we're going to be talking today about multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS. This is the image that we used at Acadience Learning. This is the image that you'll see in their training materials that represents this comprehensive school-wide system of improving outcomes for students. This encompasses not just reading and all academic outcomes, but also behavior and social supports for students as well. This is primarily a model of prevention, and that's the perspective that I'm going to be taking in talking about MTSS today, efficiently matching students to instruction and supports. And one of the central hallmarks of MTSS is a collaborative problem-solving model. The Acadience Learning approach to problem solving is not to solve problems, but to prevent them. And so you'll see it referred to as an outcomes-driven model with the 5 steps that you can see here. And this is really important when you're thinking about matching students to support, and a little bit more on that later. So the title that I chose, MTSS Mess Ups, right? Just using alliteration to catch people's attention. Don't take this personally. I'm not being critical of the work that anyone is doing, quite to the contrary. This was meant to be attention grabbing. This has been an evolution of implementing this three-tiered model really for the last 30 years. I've been involved in this work for about 32 years now, and I am simply sharing what I've observed and learned over the years to be most effective, and I'm going to focus those learnings today on the area of reading. So we're going to be talking about some of the things I'm going to refer to as mess ups, just for catchy title again, saying that you are doing MTSS but still doing business as usual. So just slapping on a new name to the same old practices. Number two, using the three tiers to talk about your students, red kids, yellow kids, green kids. Number three, not taking the opportunity to use tier one instruction as primary prevention. And I'm really happy to be following Jack Fletcher's fantastic opening session this morning, where this was the emphasis of his talk. Number four, we'll be looking at the use of the collaborative problem-solving process, how that can assist you in your work. And the fifth mess up, using placement in special ed as the ultimate outcome or solution. So we'll be talking about alternatives there. So let's start with number one, saying that you're doing MTSS but still doing the same old practices, such as refer, test, place. This is the old way of doing business, and you're going to hopefully this morning hear about some ways that this might still be creeping into your work, and ways that you could do something different to provide better supports for your students. One way that you might see this is if you're still implementing an intervention assistance team. I see these called teacher assistance teams or teacher-based teams these days. It's still the same thing, and we don't need to be doing it the way that we used to do it. MTSS is an alternative to that. Taking students out of the regular classroom, out of tier one, out of universal instruction to get their reading supports. That is an old way of operating and will not help you to get more students on track with reading. And using terminology like our MTS, I'm the MTSS teacher, or this student's going to the MTSS room, or this is our MTSS time of day. Referring to it in these limited ways rather than recognizing MTSS as a comprehensive framework for school improvement. One of the things I think is helpful is to know what MTSS was created as an alternative to. What were we doing in the past, 30 years ago, 15 years ago, that MTSS was specifically designed to be an alternative to? So refer, test, place. This is the old way of providing services and supports to students. This involved an individual teacher having a concern with an individual student, referring to a team like an intervention assistance team that sent the teacher back to try some things. They didn't work. Then a school psychologist was involved in testing, doing an evaluation for special ed, and then the placement happened. Multi-tiered systems of support is a deliberate alternative to that refer, test, place model, and we'll be exploring that a little bit more today. Being dependent, whoops, one extra click, dependent on the teacher referral is something we don't need to do anymore. This is an inefficient practice, and if you have universal screening, whether it's Acadience reading or some other universal screener, you don't need to wait for a teacher referral. That's the purpose of screening, to find those students who are at risk very early and to start providing support to them right after the screening data are collected. Back before we had MTSS models, the assessment that was done when students were being evaluated for, let's say, special education, those were tests that were done at one point in time. They were high inference measures, not really directed at what was going on in the classroom. And now if you have a system of assessment in your building that includes universal screening, progress monitoring, and diagnostic assessment, for example, with Acadience reading, you don't need to rely on those one point in time high inference assessments, mostly norm referenced assessments anymore. Back in the day, the only way to get help often was through special education. And now what we want to be moving towards is having a system of support that all students can access regardless of their eligibility status for special education, that they can access that from the point of need being identified, that they don't have to wait until they are behind to get that kind of support. So non-categorical service delivery is what we'll be discussing. We used to talk about, in that refer, test, place model, pre-referral interventions. Interventions that we would try, mostly it was frankly about documenting failure for students before we moved on to the sort of real stuff, which was about the eligibility for special ed. MTSS is not focused on special education. It is not an alternate route to special education. And special education may be a way to support students. It certainly is a necessary way to support some students, but it is not the ultimate goal of MTSS. And it should not be conceptualized or operationalized as a one-way street. If you don't have procedures in your school for how do students exit special education services, how do you fade special education services, that would be something I would encourage you to consider. And as I mentioned, making sure that we are providing cross-categorical or non-categorical services to students. The label may provide access in some cases, but the label is often not prescriptive in terms of intervention. And a label is certainly not required for intervention or prevention services. And one of the things we're going to talk quite a bit about here is making sure that we're getting the majority of students to read, and that we're doing that as early and as soon as possible. So just to summarize some of these ideas here that moved us 30 years ago towards a three-tier model of prevention, is that intervention is difficult, it's expensive, and it's not that effective, frankly, for large numbers of students. Prevention provides a much easier, less expensive, and more effective opportunity for getting more students to be readers. And that's where we really need to be focused. Make sure that you are learning and become well-versed in effective intervention and effective instruction practices. The literature base is wide and rich in terms of how to teach reading, what we should be focusing instructional time on. And if you are an educator in Pennsylvania, you certainly have the Patton network of folks to help you access this research base. And I encourage you to connect in to that. The process of collaborative problem solving is what will allow you to learn how to address any system level or student level problem that your school might be facing, how to actually use all of those data that you are collecting. So let's talk a bit about what I'm calling mess up number 2, thinking that the 3 tiers are about the students. There are 2 ways that I see this come to me. There are two ways that I hear people talking about this that represent for me a missed opportunity. One is talking about the 3-tiered model, which we sometimes represent with the color coding, green for tier 1 instruction, yellow representing tier 2 instruction, and red representing tier 3. And I hear us falling into this shorthand of red kids, yellow kids, and green kids. Who's gonna meet with the yellow kids this week? What are we gonna do with our red kids? And I think that shorthand language has put us into a misunderstanding about what those 3 tiers are about. So I'd like an opportunity to elaborate on that and hopefully give you some opportunity to shift the way that you are implementing those 3 tiers. The other way that this comes to me or comes up quite often is when people say our triangle is upside down. Now, I know what they mean by that. When people say that, they mean they have more students who are at risk than those who are not at risk. But this statement represents a fundamental misunderstanding about what the 3-tier model is about. At least one fundamental misunderstanding. So let me attempt to clarify. And you can send a message in through the chat if you have questions about this explanation. So again, this is the Acadience Learning representation of a three-tier model. In your state or district, you may have a different picture, but the representation of the concepts is pretty standardized and universal. What we are attempting to do here with this comprehensive school improvement framework is efficiently match student needs to instructional support. And this is based in a public health model. This is designed to represent 3 tiers of instructional support. And when it comes to reading, 3 tiers of prevention. So we have tier 1, what we could talk about as universal instruction, the core curriculum and instruction that we're providing to all students. This should be conceptualized as the primary prevention of reading failure. What do we do with all students to prevent reading failure for the vast majority of them? This is our #1 opportunity to prevent reading failure with the first way we teach reading in the regular ed classroom. We have tier 2 supports represented in yellow. We might call this strategic support. The purpose here is to accelerate learning for students who are identified as being at higher risk on our screening measures. And we are individualizing and amping up the explicitness of the instruction that we're providing to these students who are more at risk. This is an additional dose of instruction in addition to the tier 1 support that we're providing to all students. And students are not coming out of their 90 to 120 minutes of core reading instruction to get their strategic support at tier 2. The students who are at risk need more and better instruction. Oops. So they need to have both doses, so to speak. The tier 3 support, oh, sorry, back to tier 2. This is secondary prevention of reading failure. Tier 1 is primary prevention. Tier 2 is secondary prevention. What do we do for those who are at higher risk? And tier 3 then is tertiary prevention of reading failure for students who are already struggling readers, have a history of being struggling readers, and we want to minimize that difficulty and accelerate and intensify the support that we're providing to those students so that we can close that gap as soon as possible. So one of the common misunderstandings about this 3-tier model is related to the percentages of students that you see out to the left-hand side here. One of the misunderstandings, I think, comes from not fully understanding the concept of a benchmark goal. So this presentation is using Acadience Reading as the example. And when it comes to Acadience Reading benchmark goals, it's important to keep in mind that they are created based on the lowest score today that puts the odds in the student's favor of being a skilled reader in the future. So on the next slide, you can see the odds that are connected to scoring in each of these score categories. Students who score at or above benchmark are generally on track. The odds are generally in their favor of being skilled readers in the future. That's what it means to score at the benchmark goal. But that benchmark goal is the lowest acceptable score. It's the lowest score today that puts the odds in the student's favor of okay reading in the future. Students who score at or above that benchmark number are generally on track if instruction stays the same for them, whatever that instruction may be. And if they score below that benchmark, they are generally not on track. So students who score below benchmark have about a 40 to 60% chance of being okay readers in the future if instruction stays the same for them. And students who score well below benchmark have about a 10 to 20% chance of being okay readers in the future unless instruction changes for them. So this is the reason to do universal screening, so that you identify students in each of these score categories at least 3 times a year, particularly in kindergarten through 3rd grade, when our opportunity is greatest to influence and change those outcomes. So understanding where those benchmark goals come from is important, the 3 score categories and the odds connected to them, but then also understanding that the benchmark goal is the minimum. It's the lowest expected score. Every student who we want to be a reader needs to score at least at that benchmark goal. Your lowest, most struggling student should score at that benchmark goal for their grade, for each measure, and time of year. The mission that we're on is to get 100% of students to the benchmark goals, not because we're idealistic or visionary or hopeful, but because the benchmark goal is designed to be the lowest acceptable score. So every student who has reading as a goal needs to be at that benchmark. So with that in mind, we'll sort of revisit this 3-tier framework. In order to get 100% of students to those Acadians reading benchmark goals, the starting place is to use your first reading instruction in the regular classroom to minimize the number of students who are at risk. So you're using your core reading instruction, your curriculum, and grouping practices and your instructional routines in the general classroom to get the vast majority of students to the benchmark goals. We use 80% as the sort of proxy for that vast majority. The idea is primary prevention of reading failure starts with what we do with all students in the regular education classroom that will shrink the number of students who need something additional to a manageable percent, something like 20%. This allows us to then add on that extra dose of instruction at tier 2 at another time of day. This extra dose might be 30 to 45 minutes in a group of 3 to 5, in addition to the 90 to 120 minutes of core instruction. That will be the level of support that is typically necessary to catch up an additional group of students who are identified as being at risk on your screeners. Then it's going to take something even more individualized and explicit and systematic to get that last 5% of students to the benchmark goals. So the shift that you might be hearing here, the way that I hear it misapplied often is people think they should have 80% of their students at benchmark, 15% scoring below benchmark, and 5% scoring well below benchmark. 100% of the students should score at benchmark. What this 3-tier model is about is how do we get them all there to the benchmark goal. Everybody gets to benchmark because the benchmark goal is the minimum. This is about engineering a system of increasingly intensive instructional supports that will allow you to get every student to those benchmarks. So the real opportunity is in how you use your tier 1 instruction. I find that most schools, as they are beginning to use the 3-tier model, they often jump into focusing their assessment conversation and time on progress monitoring. They often are focusing their efforts in designing and implementing tier 2 interventions. And that is absolutely a missed opportunity. I'm calling it the #1 missed opportunity. It is very difficult to provide intervention if the core instruction is not well matched to the needs of the students in that grade level. And I think it was Anita Archer who said, you can't intervene your way out of a core instruction problem. And the problem is not that teachers aren't doing the best that they can. It's that that core instruction is misaligned to the needs of the group in front of that teacher. That's what I mean by taking advantage of this opportunity to get the first instruction right, to maximize the first way we teach reading rather than trying to retrofit and intervene after a student has been flagged as having a reading difficulty. So some additional things to consider and think about here. If you're only getting 40% of your students to benchmark, 50% of your students to benchmark, or even 60% of students to these benchmark goals, which one of those students has a disability? Is it the student, or is it the instructional environment that the student is learning in? And are you actually evaluating not just the student and the student's progress, but are you also evaluating that instructional environment? Are you considering how much all students are growing? This is a really important consideration. So I want you to think about your own Tier 1 instruction here for just a minute. While I mentioned some of the characteristics of effective first reading instruction. Keeping in mind the purpose of primary prevention, are you making sure that the vast majority of your students are learning not through your Tier 2 or 3 interventions, but through the first way that reading is taught in the regular classroom? This, again, is indicated by getting at least 80% of students to benchmark just with Tier 1 instruction. So this is really easy to evaluate in terms of your universal screening. I'm going to show you a way to do that in just a minute. Making sure that Tier 1 instruction is protected time for all students, that you don't have students coming out of their 90 to 120 minutes of Tier 1 instruction to get their reading intervention or Tier 2 support. They're not coming out of their Tier 1 to get their EL service or their speech therapy. You are maximizing for them that first reading instruction, the 90 to 120 minutes of core instruction. Many people, when they hear talk of all students accessing Tier 1, they think that means whole group for 90 to 120 minutes. And quite the contrary, that first reading instruction needs to be highly differentiated. Your screening data can help you with this. Diagnostic reading assessment will help you to even fine-tune that differentiation. The only way I've really seen the instruction to be accelerated and to get up to that 100% of students reaching the benchmark goals is with differentiated, flexible, small group instruction in Tier 1. So using your data to differentiate Tier 1 is an important element of that first reading instruction. So this is going to involve teachers knowing what to teach, how to teach it, having a systematic scope and sequence that lays out that plan of instruction from easier to harder, that includes review and practice opportunities with explicit lessons that are guided by assessment data to really maximize where students spend most of their reading instruction time, which is in Tier 1. We know from decades of research in reading that we have a very critical time period of opportunity that we can use to our advantage and our students' advantage to prevent a reading problem before it happens. We know more now than we ever have about what students need to become readers and how to teach it to them. So those would be skills around phonological awareness, letter recognition, letter sound connection, and language comprehension. Those are skills that can and should be explicitly taught in kindergarten and first grade, and we should be monitoring with assessments like Acadience reading to make sure that every student is on track and reading by the end of first grade. Intervention, frankly, will work for a few individuals, but we don't have the technology to catch students up once they have a reading problem. So an opportunity that I see many school teams not taking advantage of is using your universal screening data from Acadience reading to plan as a grade level. In many cases, I see schools and districts using the screening data only to identify individual students who need support. And we absolutely can and should be doing that. It points us to the individual students who are potentially struggling, who are predicted to have difficulty later on, but we can't take a student by student approach to implementing MTSS. We have to make sure that we're using the screening data to evaluate the instructional context. What is the context that every student is learning to read in? And have we maximized that opportunity? So this is an example from Acadian's Data Management of a first grade overview report where every first grade student is represented. Every student got the beginning of year screening. This is showing the composite score. And 56% of the first graders are on track to be readers at the end of the year. This is an opportunity to start having conversations as a grade level team about how we're going to teach reading to this group of first graders this school year. This is not about finding the individuals who make up this 15% who are below benchmark or the 29% who are well below benchmark. This is not about sending those quote unquote yellow and red kids to tier 2 or tier 3 instruction. The best way you could spend your time following the beginning of year screening is as a grade level team, planning what the implications are for teaching this new group of students who will be in front of you. I think particularly at the beginning of this school year in 2020, this is going to be an essential conversation for grade level teams, because possibly more than ever before, we are going to have lots of students who have significant reading needs at the beginning of the school year. Taking a student by student approach, thinking tier 2 instruction is going to correct for this, is not going to get us where we need to be for our students. So this is indicating at the beginning of the year that perhaps the way that we thought we were going to be teaching first grade isn't a match to the students who are now in first grade. And we need to do some careful analysis of our curriculum and instruction. Not jump to intervention, not jump to tier 2 or something outside of that 90 to 120 minutes of core instruction. Now this picture is showing the composite score. I'm just going to overlay what the rest of this report would look like at the beginning of first grade to show you that you have additional information that can be used for this conversation. This is telling me that in this particular school, 61% of the first graders are on track in terms of their ability to manipulate the sounds in spoken language. But that means I have about 40% of my first graders who aren't on track with this essential early literacy skill, phonemic awareness. So this is really an implication for grade level instruction. It wouldn't be efficient or effective to start to try to plan tier 2 intervention outside of the classroom for 40% of the first graders. What happens when we try to do that is that we dilute whatever that tier 2 resource is to the point that it's stretched so thin that it can't possibly do its job of accelerating performance and catching kids up to goal. What we need to do as an approach instead is to take this as an indication of how we should teach regular classroom first grade reading instruction. Now, I'm using first grade as an example, but this can be applied at any grade level. As we move up into second grade, the indicator we would be using at the beginning of grade 2 would be the NWF scores or whatever letter sound indicator you have from your universal screener. As we move up into the beginning of grade 3 and beyond, we'd be using the accuracy score from the ORF screener at the beginning of the year. So whichever grade level you're using, that grade level conversation using universal screening results is your best opportunity to change outcomes for your students. Because this is about looking at instruction systemically, not about going one student at a time. So I don't need to have an intervention assistance team. I don't need a teacher to refer an individual student. I already know from this beginning of year screening that first grade has an issue that needs to be addressed around teaching phonemic awareness. We can't assume, like we might have in the past, that all first graders are coming in with this skill, because here we are faced with it in the data at the beginning of the year. And this difficulty with the manipulation of sounds in spoken language is impacting what we're seeing in this letter sound and blending indicator with NWF. They're closely related. And because this is the beginning of first grade, we don't have a minute to waste. We need to be acting on this information in the regular education classroom from day one of the school year. We need to have an approach that will allow us to maximize that 90 to 120 minutes so we can differentiate it based on what every individual student needs. Mess up number 4 is not having a problem-solving process for using your data. So I've been talking about spending time as a grade level team, but how you structure that conversation is going to either help you to be able to manage and approach all of the future issues that come up to your grade level or to your school, as well as the issues that are presented with individual students. The problem-solving process is sometimes represented as a 5-step or a 4-step, or in some places a 12-step approach, but this is the question and answer process that allows you to address the concerns at the systems and student level. This is the framework for using your data, and you can use the outcomes-driven model that comes free of charge with your Acadience reading assessments, or you can use a more standard problem-solving process like I was showing on the prior screen. It doesn't matter, but if your grade level team, well, first of all, if you aren't having grade level team meetings, or if those grade level teams are not using a structured sequence of problem solving like this, this would be an excellent next step to take. I know that there is a presentation I think Lisa Bola is involved in during this literacy symposium where they are providing very detailed and specific tried and true tools that can be used during these grade level conversations, and I encourage you to investigate that. The same problem solving process would be used at Tier 3 when you are talking about individual students. So at Tier 1 and Tier 2, we're using the outcomes-driven model or collaborative problem-solving process to address the needs of groups of students, individuals who are parts of those groups. And once we get to Tier 3, that's when we can devote those intensive resources to problem-solving about individual students. What's nice about this is the same steps, the same model can be used whether we're talking about all students or in individual students. Now, the last mess up, so to speak, is related to thinking that special education is the goal of MTSS, or thinking that the solution is placement in special ed, or thinking that MTSS is just an alternate route to special education. This is a real misunderstanding that's very common, I would say, and pervasive around the country. And it's really holding us back in terms of being able to implement the kinds of preventative practices around reading that are going to help us improve outcomes for more students. So the main point that I want to leave you with here related to special education eligibility is it is essential that we find what works first. This is what I think folks have been missing or neglecting, or hasn't really been brought to folks' attention. This is not about documenting failure. MTSS, progress monitoring, even eligibility determination for special education should not be focused on documenting the student's failure. If that's all we needed to do, we could go back to the same old discrepancy model that we used to use for determination of learning disabilities. I'll be talking a little bit more about using Acadience reading in the determination of, or for dyslexia screening in a workshop that I'm doing tomorrow. But the points that are made in the dyslexia position statement from Acadience Reading are relevant here to this conversation about MTSS as well. So the indicators that are often used for screening for dyslexia or other reading disabilities can be seen here. And your data with Acadience Reading can be enormously helpful in responding to these indicators. There is no test for dyslexia. Screening is a first step. The important outcome of screening should be instruction. Decisions about eligibility for a learning disability or determination of dyslexia go beyond the scope of Acadience Reading, and they are socially constructed definitions, right? There's not a blood test for dyslexia. So keep all of that in mind when we're talking about these things. Again, the main point is what we should be driven to is not the fine-tuning of decisions about a diagnosis of dyslexia or eligibility for special ed. What we should be driven to and by is finding the instruction that works for a student. So that's the framework I want to encourage you to consider. When you're using Acadience Reading, you are screening on essential reading skills like phonemic awareness, letter sound, blending letter sound, reading text accurately and automatically, depending on the grade level that you're considering. These are essential indicators. So at the beginning of the school year, for example, and then again at the middle and the end of the school year, you are checking in with your students very briefly, which is appropriate for screening, on these essential indicators. You're getting a little snapshot or window into your students' skills in the skill areas that are predictive of reading performance. So we want to find those students who are struggling with these essential reading skills. Students like Otis here at the beginning of first grade, who's struggling with phonemic awareness and letter sound, and Evelyn, who is struggling with the same essential skills. Seeing this at the beginning of first grade is a strong indication that these are students who will not be readers at the end of first grade unless we do something now. And this is the reason to do screening at the beginning of the school year, so that you act on it. It's not to say, oh, well, they're destined and doomed to have a reading problem in the future, so I'm only going to work with those bubble kids. This is the power of your instruction that can change lives for students if you act on this information as soon as possible. Other students in this classroom are also at risk. So again, the percent of students, let me remove that so you can see, the percent of students in the class is important to consider. I'm going to have a different approach if it's just Otis and Evelyn who are scoring well below benchmark. But you can see that more than half of this first grade class is scoring well below or below benchmark. That means I need a class-wide or school-wide approach to changing my instruction to meet this need. So a second consideration when screening for reading disabilities like dyslexia is to look for how the student progresses over time, but also how the system is progressing over time. And if there's progress for all students, and if there's progress for these individuals who we're concerned about. So you'll notice the language here at the title of the slide, lack of adequate progress or resource intensive progress, because it's not about documenting that the student is low, documenting that the student is lower than other students, or documenting that the student is still low even though we've tried to intervene. What we have to be driven by is finding the instruction that works. So you're looking at a graph here again from the Acadience data management system. This is a graph for a first grade student on nonsense word fluency, the correct letter sound score specifically. The green horizontal lines across the first grade year show the benchmark goals for correct letter sounds. Again, those being the minimum levels of expectation that put the odds in the student's favor of being okay in the future. The dark colored in circle shows this student's beginning of year benchmark screening score. And you can see that Evelyn scored in the well below benchmark range at the beginning of the year, meaning that her odds of being a reader at the end of first grade are about 10 to 20%. If we get her to the end of year benchmark goal, her odds go to about 80 to 90%. So that's a meaningful amount of change that we would like to realize with our first grade instruction. The open circles are showing you her progress monitoring data in the beginning of the school year, September and October. These diagonal lines that you can just probably barely see here, I'm just going over with my cursor. These diagonal lines are the colorful lines that you see here, representing the growth of other students who started first grade with the same level of skills that Evelyn is starting with, and representing where they ended the school year. So this is what is shown to you in Acadiance Reading as the pathways of progress that you can view at the beginning of the school year to help you know how much growth is typical for a student who is going to start first grade with scores this low. I know it would be meaningful to move her from where she is now at 18 to the benchmark goal at the end of the year. It would close the gap for her. It sure looks ambitious to go from 18 to 55 or so by the end of first grade. But how attainable is it? How realistic is it? How typical is it? That's what the pathways show you at the beginning of the year. These two pieces of information, the benchmark goal and the pathways, helps teachers to select their own progress monitoring goal for the end of the year. And that's what this blue bullseye is showing you on this graph. So the teacher and the team working with this student can know exactly what the gap is, exactly the path that they need to follow to be able to close that gap. And instead of only making a decision based on a single assessment at one point in time, progress monitoring with Acadiance Reading lets you make a real-time decision about changes to your instruction, and it gives you real-time feedback about the effectiveness of what you're doing. And it will tell you in real time if you need to make a change. So you can see these open circles are the progress monitoring data points, maybe every other week. And she's tracking down here, if I sort of extend this, it's down here in the well below typical range. So in late October, there was a change made to her instruction. That's what this vertical line is. This is an intervention change line or a phase change line. There's a place in Acadiance data management to enter what that change to instruction was, so it can be represented on the graph. A change was made and they continued to monitor her performance over time, and she was still tracking in this pathway that represented below typical progress. She needed to make above typical progress to meet the goal that the teacher set. So there was a second change to instruction made in late November. Now we are going to be monitoring with this different instruction to see if we have finally found what it takes to enable her learning. I think in places where they've gotten real focused on MTSS models that are requiring a certain number of data points or a certain number of trials of intervention or a certain number of different interventions, that we've really missed the point. That what we should be focusing on is this question: what will it take to enable learning for this student? What are the characteristics of the instruction that will be required for this student to learn this essential skill? And that's what the team working with Evelyn should be focused on. How much time? How many days a week? What instructional approach? What skill should we be focused on? How explicit does the I do it, we do it, you do it cycle need to be? how many practice opportunities are required, and so on. That's the conversation, not documenting failure. So here's a different picture, well, similar picture, but for a different student, where in the case of Otis, also starting the school year with the same low score on nonsense word fluency, correct letter sounds, you can see the way that it played out for him across the first grade year, in that by March or April, he was starting to get into this pathway for making above typical progress, and he is now on track for meeting the goal that the teacher set at the beginning of the school year.
So Dr. Stollar, I do have a question that came in.
Oh, good, Karen.
However, I have two, but this one is directly related to this. Are students placed in Tier 3 at the beginning of the year if their beginning of year Acadian scores fall within the intensive classification?
Not necessarily. So let's just go back to Evelyn. So she is a beginning of year first grader who scored in the well below benchmark range. That doesn't necessarily mean that she should receive Tier 3 support. So if Evelyn is, let me go just ahead a little bit. If Evelyn is a student, a first grade student in a school like this, where only about half of the first graders are on track, at the beginning of the year, I can't say that every student who scores well below benchmark should get Tier 3 support. I'd have 30% of the grade level in Tier 3. That's a misapplication of a MTSS model. If the instructional context, let me go back to Evelyn. If the instructional context is such that only half of the students at that grade level are on track, that's not an indication that any individual student should get intensive instructional support, because which one would you choose? If half of the students are below or well below benchmark, if 30% of the students are scoring well below benchmark, that doesn't necessarily equate to needing Tier 3 instruction. The first response to that kind of a grade level scenario, to your screening data at the beginning of first grade, should be to analyze and improve what you're doing in Tier 1 instruction. That's the first response. So back to Otis. In the scenario with Otis, we found some instruction over time, right? It didn't happen quickly. We started right away. We didn't use MTSS to delay providing instructional support. We started immediately. We were monitoring and getting feedback. We made changes to his instruction when we could see on the graph that what we were doing was not sufficient. We made 2 changes throughout the school year, careful, planful, intentional changes to his instruction. And now we can see that he is making progress. If what it takes for a student to make progress, to get caught up, is unique and individualized and requires resources beyond the scope of general education, in a context where most students are learning to read, that's the time when we can start to suspect a disability and formalize then what we have already found that works onto an IEP. This is what MTSS was designed to do. This is the alternative to that old refer, test, place, you're in special ed forever with low expectations and not a lot of growth model that we used to do. Okay, so I'm gonna just spend the last couple of minutes here putting a fine point on some things that we've already been discussing. The third criteria, and again, we'll go into these ideas a little bit deeper in the dyslexia screening and Acadience reading session tomorrow. But the third indicator for risk for reading difficulties is related to generally effective instruction. This is language that comes from the federal special education law, specifically from exclusionary criteria that need to be applied. You can't say that a student has a disability unless you can document that they have received generally effective instruction. So how could you quantify generally effective instruction? Well, in an MTSS model, that could be if you are getting the majority of students, 80% or more, to the Acadience reading benchmark goals with first reading instruction only. If you're getting the majority of students to be readers, if you're getting them to the reading expectations or benchmark goals, that's good evidence that your system is providing generally effective instruction. So this is what I meant when I said it's not just about evaluating the student. We have to be evaluating the instructional context as well. And we have to be able to demonstrate that this individual student, let's say Evelyn or Otis, this student was educated in a generally effective classroom or grade level environment. So here's what the overview report from Acadience Data Management would look like across the year. Another question.
Dr. Stollar, I have another question that came in that you might want to address at this point as well. What if the intervention is showing growth for the child, but still not closing the gap, and intensity is increased after a certain amount of time?
Yeah, great question. So this is exactly what the Pathways was designed for. Karen, can I ask you to read the question again?
Of course. What if the intervention is showing growth for the child, but still not closing the gap, and intensity is increased after a certain amount of time?
Yeah, so this is before we had Pathways to inform our work. We used to think any growth was good enough, right? We'd be monitoring the student, and the reference point, well, we had two reference points back before we had Pathways. We had the benchmark goal, and we had the individual student's performance relative to his own past performance, right? So we'd be looking on the progress monitoring graph for the dots to be going up, right? That was our reference point. If he's growing, like let's just take here, this is a decent visual of it. If it's going up, then that's good, right? So even if the student is growing, even if the dots are going up, it might not be sufficient. And this is what not only the benchmark goal, but the addition of the Pathways can tell us. Here with Otis, his performance is increasing, but he's still in the well below typical growth range, or Pathway 2. He's not growing as much as other students who started the year with the same level of skills. So not comparing him to all first graders, but comparing his amount of growth only to other first graders who started just as low as he did. That's the reference point for the Pathways. So it's telling us exactly how much growth is enough. And if a student who starts the year well below benchmark only grows in a way that represents typical progress, like you can see here, that student is probably not going to catch up and close the gap. Typical progress is most often not sufficient for students who are starting the year well below benchmark. For those students, it's going to take above or well above typical growth. Now, there's variation in that, and one of the great things about Pathways is it's customized to every grade level and every beginning of year skill. It's much easier to catch students up in kindergarten and first grade. The amount of growth that's typical is a steeper slope in kindergarten and first grade than it is in the upper grades, which is just an additional plug for prevention and starting early. So Karen, read that question one more time. I just want to make sure I've addressed all the points. It was kind of chock full of
It was,
elements.
and there are many others.
Okay, good.
Coming in as well.
Good, bring it on.
Yep. So this question was, what if the intervention is showing growth for the child, but still not closing the gap, and intensity is increased after a certain amount of time?
Yes, so okay, I'm gonna go back to my, my urging that you find what works. So if the student is growing and you've increased the intensity, right? That's what we're showing here. We've changed the support. We've reduced the group size. We've increased the number of minutes, the number of opportunities to respond. we've gotten more explicit and systematic with the instruction, and the student still isn't growing, we haven't found what works. We still need to be analyzing the instruction and intervention that we're providing. We need to be carefully and thoughtfully making additional changes to that instruction until we find what works. Because what's the alternative? Back in the old model, refer, test, place, when we were just documenting failure, we were satisfied with saying, well, we tried some things and the student didn't grow enough, so he must have a disability and we're going to write an IEP. And then in my experience, often the student was deemed eligible for special education and started then receiving support from a special educator. And that special educator often then didn't know what to do with the student. So nothing perhaps different happened, and the student still didn't make adequate progress, still didn't learn to read. And so that approach wasn't helpful. We have to first find what works. We can apply, if we're using cross-categorical or non-categorical service delivery, we can apply specialized instruction before a student is on an IEP. And if what it takes to get growth, so this is the first thing we have to be focused on, get the growth. Find out what it takes to get the growth. Don't be satisfied with lack of growth. Find out what it takes. And if what it takes to get the growth from the student, for the student, is unique and individualized and can only be maintained with specialized supports, that's when we suspect a disability and formalize what we've already found to be working onto that IEP. Okay, additional questions?
Okay, so there are questions about when to decide to move students into a tier 3 intervention. And is it, and then there are some questions related to typical school as well as school with the pandemic closures. So is it out of the question to put certain students who are not making progress as of March when schools close, to put them in tier 3 instruction at the very beginning of the school year? And just a general question about how do you address all of this if learning continues to be remote?
Well, that's a bunch of loaded questions right?
There is. I tried to combine a few.
Yeah.
There's many more. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to refer you back to the collaborative problem solving process. So that's your best opportunity for addressing those kinds of complex questions. And part of the problem solving model is going to have you to identify decision rules for things like, when do we move between the tiers? When do students go from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3? When do they go from tier 3 to tier 2 to tier 1? So movement between the tiers should be a building level team decision using the collaborative problem solving process based on your school's data, so that you have standardized decision rules that are data based for making those decisions. So that's the first place that I would point you to for a response to that. Is it reasonable to assume that a student who was in need of more intensive instructional supports before school closed in March is still in need of those supports when you come back? Let's say you do come back, either physically or virtually at the beginning of the school year. Yes, I think that's reasonable to assume. And I think you can pick up where you left off with a student like that, so that you don't lose any more time. But I, again, want to take people back to realizing that your intervention system, tier 3 and tier 2, cannot sit on top of a shaky foundation. The only way that you can provide what's actually intensive support, so something like, let's say, an hour to an hour and a half of reading intervention, in addition to 90 to 120 minutes of core reading instruction for a 4th grader, let's say, the only way it's reasonable to provide that amount and intensity of intervention at tier 3 is if you're doing it with a very small number of students. And the best way I know of to shrink the number of students who need strategic and intensive support is by getting it right in Tier 1. So I think at the beginning of next school year, whether we are in person or virtual, this is going to be more important than ever. And your instinct may be to go to supporting individual students. Here's one who needs support. Here's another one who lost ground over the absence from school. Here's another one. And your instinct may be to focus on those individual students. What I want to try to get you to consider is looking at the problem more systemically. That's what MTSS is designed to do. Get a picture, and you could do this from your middle of year screening data this past school year, or if you quickly collect it at the beginning of next school year, get a picture of the needs of the grade level and start to approach that scenario systemically, not student by student only. Start to do some planning as a grade level. You can start this now. You can assume that more kids are at risk than you had when you closed school in March, and start planning for that now. What is going to be needed to hit the ground running with those students? What are the skills that the prior grade level didn't get to? What are the students likely to still need in the area of early literacy or basic reading skills? And how are we as a third grade team or a second grade team going to meet that need? We're going to perhaps need to know more about teaching foundational reading skills than we have in the past. Where could we get some support? How do we access what our state is offering? For example, if you're in Pennsylvania, through the letters training that's available, what materials are we going to use? What instructional routines, and so on and so on. That grade level conversation for providing class-wide instruction in reading is going to be more important than ever. So that's where I want to put the emphasis. If you try to approach the beginning of next school year, student by student, you will quickly be overwhelmed. That's been the MTSS model all along, but it's something that people haven't really, it hasn't really been emphasized or brought to people's attention as much possibly as it could have. So we've got an opportunity to really get that right this year. The University of Florida, it's called UFLI, University of Florida's probably Literacy Institute. Holly Lane is the director there. They have some amazing resources for teaching reading in a virtual environment. Lots and lots of videos in their library about how to teach phonemic awareness, how to teach phoneme grapheme mapping, how to support students to read text accurately and fluently. And you can access all of those materials through UFLI on their website. Karen, other questions?
Yes. So if we cannot generally quantify that a student has access to effective instruction, and a student is suspected to have a disability, how do we honor a child's rights to access special education per OSEP's direction that we cannot use RTI to delay evaluation or identification?
Well, there are aspects of the federal special education law, IDEA, that are related there, right? So you can't deny access, but you also can't determine eligibility unless you have dealt with those exclusionary criteria. And I've only mentioned one of them here, which was generally effective instruction. So if you have universal screening, which you should with any MTSS model, then you've got a picture of whether or not your instruction is generally effective. So here's the example I was using with Acadiance Data Management's overview report. This is a picture of what it looks like when you can document that your classroom grade level instruction is generally effective. If you're getting more students to benchmark at the middle and end of the year than you had at the beginning of the year, that's good evidence for generally effective instruction. I think this is one of the best and the easiest ways to meet that criteria. The other thing I would say is keep in mind that eligibility for special education is not necessarily the goal. The goal is to find what works. So you're not using MTSS to delay supports, to delay an evaluation. You're using it to match the needs of the students to the instruction and support that you're providing. Right away at the beginning of the school year, you know what students need. You know it from your screening data. You know it for the grade level. You know it for the individuals. And if you're starting to provide that systemic grade level classroom, very intentional support to all of the first graders, and then monitoring progress for some students you're particularly concerned about, then you are responding to their need. And so it's a combination of those things, I guess I would say, in response to that question.
Mm-hmm. And you've mentioned generally effective instruction. Does that apply just to a learning disability, or how does it apply to other disabilities, for example, speech and language?
That's a really good question. And I have only been into this portion of the law recently for specific learning disabilities. So I don't honestly remember. I'd have to look to see about the exclusionary criteria if they are related to other disability categories. Maybe somebody else who's in the presentation knows and can send us the answer through the chat. I just know of it related to the SLD eligibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm just going down through the list. So if students are showing growth in the classroom assessments, but not showing growth on the timed benchmark assessments, how do we address these concerns?
When it comes to foundational early literacy skills, automaticity is critical. That's why the Acadience reading measures are timed. It's one of the reasons why. So just knowing these foundational skills is not sufficient. You have to know them so well that you are in fact fast and automatic at them, because they are foundational. They are the building blocks of reading comprehension. So another assessment, you mentioned a classroom assessment that's perhaps untimed, that's asking students to perform the same or similar skills, doesn't carry as much weight in terms of predicting reading comprehension down the road. It's about automaticity of these foundational skills, not just accuracy, being able to segment phonemes, but can you do it without devoting any cognitive energy to doing it? Can you decode so automatically that your brain doesn't have to focus on what word is this? Your brain can focus on the meaning of the word and the series of words that you're reading in a passage or a story.
Thank you. Just a clarifying question. I'm not sure at what point in the presentation this came in, so perhaps this was answered for the person. But on the pathways graph, is it comparing the student to peers in that particular school, or all students who have been assessed?
All students who have been assessed around the country. So millions of students who had the same level of skills at the beginning of the school year. So again, the reference point for the pathways is not all students at the grade level. It's specific to the many thousands of students who had the same scores that your student did at the beginning of the year, not just in your school, but comparing nationally. And Acadience Learning had free training on their website on Pathways of Progress. So if that's a tool that you're not familiar with, you might want to look into and access the free training on Pathways of Progress. I think this tool is a game changer. I mentioned it in terms of setting goals at the beginning of the school year and monitoring individual student growth over time, but there are other ways to use Pathways of Progress that I haven't mentioned, by aggregating student data at the class and school level so that you are having additional lenses into that generally effective instruction idea.
Excellent, thank you. And if you are from Pennsylvania, Patton has some resources that can help support the Pathways to Progress as well. And one more just came in. Why don't the Acadience assessments include phoneme manipulation? Dr. Kilpatrick's work indicates the relationship between phoneme manipulation and sight vocabulary.
Yes, great question. So we have always, since I've been related to these assessments, now called Acadience Reading, known that what we have to teach is broader than what we assess. So we have to teach the full range of phonological and phonemic awareness skills all the way through the advanced manipulation tasks. What Acadience Reading does is help you screen and find students early. So at the end of kindergarten, the best predictor of reading comprehension in the future is whether or not a student can segment phonemes. It's not the only skill you teach in kindergarten. It's not the hardest skill you should teach in kindergarten. You shouldn't stop teaching phonemic awareness in kindergarten, but the best indicator of phonemic awareness and the best predictor of future reading comprehension is, can a student segment phonemes? And if a student can't, then we can provide that support around phonemic awareness. We can see that come out in future grade levels in first grade and beyond, in both the NWF scores and the ORF accuracy scores. And if students struggle with those screening measures, then we definitely want to follow up with additional diagnostic assessments, whether that's something that you use in your building or the Acadience Reading Diagnostics.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's all of the questions. I think we've been able to address all of the questions that have come in. It is 11:45. If you're ready to close out, we can start that.
Okay. Yes, so I just again want to thank everyone for your time and for the great questions today. I hope some of you might join me in the session tomorrow that's specific to Acadience Reading and screening for dyslexia. Many of the same topics will be revisited. And I wish you all the best of luck as you move into next school year. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Stollar, thank you so much. And thanks to all of the participants who attended and submitted questions today as well. And I will say most of the comments were just reaffirming how wonderful the information that you shared today and always. So I know we had people chime in from California who said, Dr. Stollar has been in our school and delivered professional development. So everybody was so appreciative of the information this morning. Yes. So I will remind you that this session was recorded and all of the symposium sessions will be recorded and they'll be available shortly on our Patent YouTube channel. A lot of you have inquired as to the availability and you are welcome. There is no charge to access those on the Patent channel. And feel free to share those, please, with other people in your buildings and districts. The Patent team will also be creating additional supports aligned to these presentations at the symposium to help maximize your learning that you can share then with families and educators as